Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar is part of the IAWL, the Institute of African Women in Law's initiative to curate discussions that provide practical guidance and inspiration for African women in various aspects of legal practice. And this particular seminar focuses on pivoting from practice to a PhD. The larger series is aptly named Power to Pivot and is focused on women, African women in legal practice who would like to, or who have never thought it possible to explore a different career path within the law than the one they're currently on. And this is the second session of 3 in this series, and it focuses on the PhD journey. I'm joined today by 3 amazing women who have seized the power to pivot from practice to PhD and who have generously agreed to share their journey and their lessons with us. Thank you for being so generous with your time. So I have with me today Kholofelo Kugler, Adejoké Babington-Ashaye, and Shingira Masanzu. All 3 of them have spent some years in practice, and then at some point in the journey of their career decided that they would go into a PhD, and they've done it. So here they are to share with us today how they made that transition and to provide some guidance so that those who are considering it have some thinking points around the journey. Thank you very much for coming, ladies.
Thank you. Very honored to be here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
So we will begin now by learning about the why. How did you get here? Can you tell us briefly about your journey from practice to PhD? At what point did you realize you wanted to do one? And what elements influenced your decision, your choices? And how long did that journey take from deciding I would do it to actually doing it? Kholo, can I start with you?
Sure. So when I completed my LLB, this was in 2010. I never thought I would do a PhD. Actually, I thought I was done with studies. I was just, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a practicing lawyer. This is something that I've always wanted to do. So I just thought, well, I'm done. But I had an opportunity to do my master's in Bern in Switzerland at the World Trade Institute in International Trade Law. And this is what I'm specialized in. And after that, I sort of toyed with the idea of going to PhD. I had an opportunity in 2015 to do a PhD. I spent 6 months doing research and I decided this is not for me. And 2018, I started again, and then I decided I wasn't ready. And then eventually in 2020, 2021, I started thinking about what I would like to do, because I think the topics that I sort of thought about before weren't really appetizing. There was a shift at the WTO. There was a lot of uncertainty, especially in the Trump era. And so I decided then to apply into tech and law and to try and marry technology with international trade law. And this is what I'm doing right now with the University of Lucerne in Switzerland.
Thank you. It's interesting to note that the journey didn't go from, hey, I'm going to do it till I did it, that you had a think and then a rethink, and critically 2 research sessions.
Definitely.
Can you share with us your journey? How did you get there?
Yeah, sure. So I also wanted to do a PhD. I had the idea of it many years before actually started. So I think in like 2010, 2011, I was like, I really want to do one, but I had certain non-negotiables. So for instance, it had to be a topic that I felt I could contribute. I kept saying to people, to my friends, like, I did not want to work on a PhD that would end up collecting dust in a library. And so I was struggling personally to find a research topic that I felt I could commit years to, and I could see the practical application of whatever I come up with. And then also it was really important that the program enabled ongoing work, because I couldn't really see myself being this student and just being in school all throughout. I wanted to be able to juggle work and doing the PhD. And then finally, I wanted no residency requirements. So I had like this really high expectation for the school, not for myself, for the schools. And so I, checked out different things, and I didn't really find anything that fit. And then I forgot about it. And in 2019, Johns Hopkins created a practitioner doctorate program. And around the same time, it's just like wonderful how life brings everything together. Around the same time, I had started a research fellowship at Harvard, and that was focused on years of work doing capacity building training on sexual terrorism, international criminal law. And I thought, you know what, this could be something I could actually do. Interestingly, talking to Shingi, Shingi mentioned to me that she was applying for her PhD, and that reawakened all the, the desires that were long asleep. And I went online and then saw that Johns Hopkins had created this program. So the rest is history. That's how I'm here.
It's interesting how our journeys are similar but different. That you also didn't have a straight to, hey, I'm going to do a PhD and then it's done. And I like that you were particularly clear what you wanted from the school. I think a lot of the time we think of what we want to be for the PhD, but we don't spend as much time thinking about the institution and even the town that it's going to be in and what that implies for the rest of your life. So that's an interesting journey, and thanks for sharing that thinking point with us. Shingi, how did you get here?
Yeah, so mine I think is a slightly more straightforward journey in the sense that I sort of knew for a while that I wanted to do a PhD at some point. So I did my master's in 2012, finishing in 2013. And I knew at that point that at some point I want to do a PhD. So it was always really more a question of timing. So when exactly to do it and sort of thinking about the implications of stepping out of work for a stretch of time or finding a chunk of time to actually step out and do a PhD. And also I wasn't necessarily clear on what I wanted to do the PhD in, but I've always sort of enjoyed being in academic spaces. I love school, I love all of that sort of thing. So doing a PhD was something I knew I wanted to do. And then I think after a few years in practice, working in development, some ideas around what I would be interested in spending time thinking about started to crystallize in my mind. I will also say, I think it helped being surrounded by a lot of people who, value research or academia and relatives, et cetera, who also have research backgrounds. So it was kind of always something circulating in the atmosphere, if you will. And then I eventually decided, I've done a few years of practice. It'll be nice to sort of step back, think about what it is I've been doing, in part because I sort of found in the thick of doing deals and working on projects, it's lots of fun. It moves very fast, but you don't necessarily have the luxury of time to sit back and reflect and cogitate about what you're doing. So it's sort of PhD sort of came to mind as a way of that desire to think about my practice in a more reflective way. And also just to get back into academic spaces. So that's how I ended up doing that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's interesting, again, that we have a different thinking point coming from just hearing about your journey as well. And then it's the importance of community. And, that part of the reason your desire didn't stay idle was because you were surrounded by people who kind of had an interest in academic work and research. And so, so from this question alone, for those of you who are listening and considering this, note, we have some time, we have research, we have institutional requirements, like think about the institution, don't just worry about you. And also keep a community. So don't try and do it in isolation, thinking it through yourself, talk to people who are in research spaces. And so, so from the 4 very different journeys, here we are, some great thinking points for how to plan this journey. Adejoké, let me ask, did you face any challenges as you pivoted? Because you were very clear on what you wanted from the institution. So I assume that by the time you chose Johns Hopkins, you were very clear it was for you. But did you face any challenges in the transition?
So I would say that yes. And it's interesting that one of the challenges is connected to one of my requirements. And so it's funny how you have this ideal. So for instance, I really wanted to be able to juggle work and, studying, and lo and behold, that was a challenge. So it's interesting that you have that as one of the things and you're finally able to do it. And then you realize like, wait a minute, it's actually not as easy as I thought. At the same time, I don't regret it because it's just in terms of my character, I know that I enjoy being busy and having different things that I'm doing. So it's a question of overcoming those challenges. And so, for instance, like time management was essential. I remember my first semester having, basically 2 laptops, my work laptop and my personal laptop. And I like switch on for a meeting, finish the meeting, and then like quickly switch to my personal laptop, to jump into class. And in a way, this is also, like, it's weird to say one of the blessings of COVID being that I could take class remotely and I was at home and working. So I was able to, to juggle that in that sense. But time management, I discovered, and this in a way is like one of the blessings also of having practice, because you're so used to, you have deadlines and stuff like that. So you work and build that skill. And so I was then able to apply that here. The other thing I would say is creating bite-size or taking a bite-size approach to my work, to my thesis or my research. So if I'm leaving everything to when I feel like researching, it's not going to happen. Or I feel like writing, that's not going to happen. So I would be like, all right, here we go. Set the timer 30 minutes. If I can accomplish 30 minutes in this day, I am so proud of myself. Like, pat myself on the back, like, girl, you're doing a good job. And then, of course, as it happens naturally, the 30 minutes extends to an hour, and then extend because you're into it. But you set the intention of like, okay, you know what? Let me just do 30 minutes, at least 30 minutes a day on my thesis, And so that's how I was able to juggle one of the challenges that I faced once I embarked on the program.
If you were advising women in a similar challenge, with a similar challenge, what would be your top tip? Like one line, like bite-sized voice note, keeping in your head, what would be your top tip for getting past that challenge?
Top tip would be kind to yourself. I think that's it. Like, so you're doing it anyway. You're trying your best. So be kind to yourself as you juggle, as you create those bite-sized like time slots in which to get things done. And if you have a supportive environment, and not everyone does, but if you do, like, take advantage of that to be able to create creative work schedules, if that's possible for you. And then if it really isn't, then just find ways to have those little moments for yourself to do your work. I remember a former colleague of mine sharing that, he had like 4 kids, like full family house, like everything crazy. So he would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning just to be able to get 1 hour to work on his thesis. And I was like, oh, wow, I don't have that, but I have like the other things that are taking my attention. So I still have to create something that works for me.
Whatever your circumstance, you will have some challenge around time. I see all the ladies nodding. We come from very different background spaces, but we all have had trouble with the time management and the figuring out when you're most productive. And so yeah, take that time tip seriously. Shingira, I saw you nodding, and you also mentioned thinking about the right time to do the PhD and finding that chunk of time. So I was wondering, what was the transitional process? If you could tell us a bit more about the nuts and bolts. Did you take a sabbatical? Did you quit work? How did you find a supervisor? How did you navigate funding, which is a big one, for all PhD students?
No, absolutely.
Continent, clearly.
Yeah, so the timing piece actually is a good place to start, because I essentially started my PhD at the height of the pandemic. So I took a sabbatical leave of absence, extended study leave, to be more precise, from work. And of course, taking that step at the height of the pandemic was a slightly questionable move. So essentially stepping out of the workforce and not getting paid for, a couple of years to do this at the height of the pandemic, when everyone's talking about recessions, et cetera, coming up, that was a little bit dicey. I mean, I just sort of took the plunge. So in terms of timing, at some point I decided this is the year I want to explore this, and just sort of proceeded with it and committed to making the move then. In terms of some of the nuts and bolts aspects, so I sort of settled on geographically where I wanted to study. So I'd been living in the US for a while, and I was like, okay, I think I've spent enough time there. I did my master's degree there. And my first degree was from South Africa. So I thought, let me venture to a new continent for my PhD. So I settled on the UK as a good location. It mattered sort of the duration of the program, so the standard 3 to 4 years that you get on this side. And then from there, sort of narrowing down and sort of sifting through really good schools and finding within those ones where there might be supervisors that have expertise or research interests aligned with the things that I'm interested in doing. So that sort of helped me to narrow things down. And then within that, I emailed a couple of people who I thought would be good potential supervisors to see if they were taking students. It so happened that one of the people I emailed was at LSE, and she was taking students at that point in time. So that sort of facilitated or concretizing my decision to sort of apply to LSE. But essentially I had a short list of 3 schools, and that's sort of how I whittled them down, applied to those 3. Funding was really the next sort of decision point. So I had 2 offers in hand. The LSE PhD is fully funded. The other school, it was Oxford, and they were taking a while, let's put it this way, to decide on funding. And it was like an ongoing process with a lot of, unclarity about how it would proceed. So to me, it was kind of like, listen, there's a really good student package being offered by LSE. It comes funded. It gives me certainty in terms of just pull the trigger now and keep it moving. So I went with LSE, and that sort of helped me get away from the need to navigate funding issues and sort of all of these other things. So that's sort of the summarized version of how I made sort of those transition moves.
Well, thank you. Speaking as an Oxford PhD student, I can completely agree with you on the anxiety stretch between when they decide on funding and I remember contacting the department myself to ask, well, when will I know? And they're like, oh, you'll hear in time. And so yeah, it's good to know that sometimes you have to make a choice, not necessarily about. I assume that you would have enjoyed the PhD, the DPhil at Oxford as well, but sometimes you have to make a choice based on the greater context, and it's wise not to put yourself through undue funding anxiety if you can avoid it. So it's good to know. For those thinking about it in our audience, remember to think through your relationship with work. Like Shingi said, she had to think through whether it was a good time to leave the workforce. But from her story, you notice that there is no perfect time and there'll always be a risk, right? So, I'm sure Kolo can tell us a similar story about taking a risk and same for Joke. So on that thought, I would say, be willing to take some risks, but think through which ones. Kolo, actually coming to you, most people think of a PhD and you think, oh, you're going to be an academic. And so when you're talking about pivoting into a PhD mid-career, people think, why? You're a practitioner. So just wondering, how does your decision to do a PhD contribute to your career trajectory? Are there any myths you encounter you would like to help us debug about the relationship between a PhD and a necessary career in academia?
So actually, my topic was, I picked it because of my career trajectory. So I'm using hopefully my PhD, not only like to pivot to something, but to really sort of broaden my scope. So as I said to you, I'm doing an intersection of international trade law and technology for the reasons that tech is the future, and especially trade matters and tech are very interesting, and there's just a lot to study. And so the very reason why I chose this, and of course because of my supervisor, that's the reason why I chose the University of Lucerne, which is a nothing university in the middle of nowhere, but my supervisor happens to be, the expert on this topic, and that's why I chose the institution. And so, yeah, that's basically it. I also sort of noticed that there's a lack of, or shortage of expertise, especially in Africa, on tech matters, and tech and trade matters, of course, as well. And so I hope to be able to contribute, after my degree. And as for the, academia PhD, I just do not agree that, just because you're doing a PhD, you want to go into academia. For me, as I explained to you, there was a specific reason why I chose to do a PhD. And I didn't want to do sort of these, 1-year masters, which of course you can, but I really wanted to get into, the nuts and bolts of my topic. And I want to produce research that is well thought out, that can be useful. And so I didn't think that a master's was enough for that. And I couldn't pivot into the field from where I was working. So it was really sort of, for me, a very sort of thought out, intentional topic and intentional, hopefully, plan that I can execute in 2.5 years. So absolutely, you don't have to be an academic just because you're doing a PhD. You can if you want, of course, but there are various reasons why people choose to take, an academic, a PhD as opposed to doing other things to pivot into something else.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That's very true. For some of us, academy was the direction, but it doesn't have to be. And I like that you could see clearly how your journey in a PhD and your post-PhD career could be connected. I don't think everybody has that kind of clarity, but I just think it's important for people for our audience to start from the premise that it doesn't have to lead to a career in the academy, and perhaps spend some time thinking about how they could make the connections as they're doing the journey, thinking into how to apply to a PhD.
Right. If I could just add, is it okay to just add to Kholo's point?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks. So for instance, my program is practitioner oriented. So for those who want to have that, that terminal degree, but definitely they know for sure we're not interested in academia and so on, you can apply. There are many programs that are really practitioner oriented and focus on the practitioner's interests, research interests, and how your work will, fit, for instance, into policy and shape policy and things like that. So if you know that that's what you want, look for those programs. I think one of the things for me, like I applied to 5 or 6 programs, and ultimately Johns Hopkins was the perfect one for me. But I applied to many programs, even though I knew the things I wanted. I applied to many programs, including programs that honestly would just not have been a good fit for me, would not have been a good fit for what I wanted. They would have been trying to shape my research into a certain professor's goals and research interests and so on. And that's not what I wanted. So ultimately, things worked out that the school that, like, once I really looked at it, I thought, oh my gosh, I really should have only, applied to Johns Hopkins and saved all that application money, was what I thought.
So I hear from Kholo and I hear from you that you have no regrets about your choice of institution. I also have no regrets about my choice of institution. Shingi, can I take it that you don't either?
No, I don't. And I actually just want to jump on the same bandwagon as Kholo and Adejoké and say, just sort of 2 things. So I definitely had people who said to me like, oh, you're doing a PhD, I guess you want to leave and become an academic, which I found so puzzling for similar reasons. But just sort of 2 things. A, you can decide, I think, based on how you pick your topic and design your research, whether you're angling yourself for academia or angling yourself for practice. So in my cohort, there's people who've got very theoretical, academic inclined sort of PhDs, but there's also people who are coming from practice who have designed their research questions and their approach specifically with a view to providing input into policy or going back into work. So I think there is a lot more perhaps control one has in deciding which way your PhD takes you. I think there's a lot to be said for a choice of the program, which is what Adejoké was just explaining as well, but also how you shape your question, how you design your research, what you actually do with it and the work product you produce, that can set you up to go back into practice or into industry or to make a pivot like what Kholo is saying her PhD will allow her to do.
Before we go on, I'd like to announce to our audience that we're taking questions in the chat box, which our panelists will be happy to answer once we finish our general discussion. So please, if you have a question, do type it in and we'll take a look. We will also be asking really quick data poll questions, just a handful. Will take you 2 seconds to answer. So if I'll let you know when our tech team is ready to share the questions with you, and please take the minute to fill the questions for us. We'd be really grateful. The feedback helps us to design programs that are feeding our audience's needs. And the Institute of African Women in Law, as a center, we want to be able to help African women do things that we don't have guidance for, as much guidance for, that are not as well-trodden paths as others. So we have 3 questions here. Please take the poll. Do you have a PhD? It's a yes or no question. Is acquiring a PhD beneficial for your professional trajectory? And then are you interested in pursuing a PhD? So please take a minute and answer the questions. Please answer the questions even if you're not female. We would like to know generally. Thank you very, very much. We'll just give you a second to answer that. And then I'm going to ask on this theme of the connection between PhD and academia, because for people in the academy, it's almost a no-brainer. So they're not really having anxiety about whether to do a PhD or not. They know they will at some point, at some place, on some topic. It's the details that are a bit fuzzy. But for people in practice, sometimes the desire to go back to school can be confusing for the person who has it, because they know they don't want a life in the academy. And so they wonder, like, what the heck am I going to do with this? Why do I feel this need to go down this road? And so, like, I noticed Kholo said she thought about it and then she forgot about it and then she went back to the research. And I think that may be a fairly common experience. I was wondering what your thoughts are about knowing clearly the connection between your life as you see in the future and the PhD for people considering it while they're finishing up on that poll.
If you don't mind me jumping in. So my specific topic is actually on artificial intelligence. And a lot of people think that I'm crazy because I'm writing on something that is literally developing as we sit, you know, and I'm finding it like you read something and they're like, oh, that's so 2 years ago, you know, every week. But for me, that's so exciting to find a topic that excites you, right? Like I could have written something on, you know, dispute settlement, which is something that I do, you know, dispute settlement and international trade law, which is something that I can write about, you know, in my sleep. I could probably write a whole textbook on that. And I love it, but I really did my PhD is my passion project. So, you know, there are various reasons why you do it. But for me, I know that I'm going to go back to practice for sure. I have no aspirations to be, you know, in academia. I do lecture and I love it, but I know what I want to do with my life. So I guess ultimately what I'm saying is that, like, you have to really think about, especially when you're in practice and especially when you're going to lose out on a lot of income like I am, you know, sort of going into a PhD or going back to school. So I really, you know, think about it. And as Adejoké was saying, see how it's going to work in your life. I have a family, I have a very young children, and I really identify with the 4 a.m. reading sessions. So yeah, it's got to work. But if you really want to do it, I would say just jump in, just go for it.
Shingi, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just actually echo what Kholo just said about just jumping in and doing it. So I think we can spend a lot of time in life where you have itch you want to scratch, you want to go into, you want to do research, you want to do a PhD, you want to go back into some sort of academic space. And it can be something that's sort of in the back of your mind and you're sort of spending a lot of time going back and forth. Sometimes I'm an advocate for just taking the plunge and doing it. The way I think about it also is, okay, listen, go for it. If you hate it after a year, you can always leave and go back into practice, or you can always repivot again after making that initial pivot. So I tend to be of the view that if it's something that is, you know, an itch that you feel like scratching, something that's constantly in the mind is something you're interested in doing, just start taking the steps towards doing it and give it a shot and see what happens. I think it also is helpful, and I think this is what helped for me, sort of having a few years in practice, being able to join the dots between what I do in practice, what I want to research, and going back into practice. So my work is looking at infrastructure investment in African countries. That is a lot of what I used to do in practice. So I'm drawing a lot from my practice and practical experience into my research and looking to sort of make new insights and create new knowledge related to that. But that also sort of gives me an anchor back into going back into practice or areas of practice that I'm interested in. So I think thinking about things strategically in that way. I also know people who've done a PhD specifically to exit the area that they were practicing and using it as a way of building expertise in an entirely new domain. that's also viable. So that's kind of how I think about it. If it's something you want to do, give it a shot, and there's multiple opportunities embedded in making such a move.
Okay, I'm going to ask Adejoké her thoughts because I saw her nodding emphatically, but before she does, can I remind people, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We would love to answer all your questions, but we will not be taking them orally, so please type them out and I'll share them with the panelists in a few minutes. Adejoké?
Yeah, I would just add to that, or anyone who's contemplating and struggling with the decision, just imagine what it sounds like when someone calls you Dr. Masanzu, Dr. Babington-Ashaye. Like, yes, I am a doctor of whatever it was that I did. So if anything, I mean, thinking strategically, like Shingira was saying, I'm noticing more and more, even in practice, like some job descriptions, they would say, okay, minimum requirement master's, but, PhD desirable. And you're thinking, what? And so you have people who have, stayed in practice 15 years, and then somebody else with a doctorate, like, is perceived as, having more qualifications or whatever than them, which is not necessarily always the case. So if you're thinking of, like Shingira was saying, some people are using the process of getting a doctorate to pivot to a completely different area of practice. If you're thinking about that, know that more and more companies, law firms, international organizations are asking for that. And so that could be another motivator for you to get it. As everyone has shared, it's so important to do something though that you actually are enjoying, because there's nothing worse than spending either 3 years, 4 years, however long of your life, doing something that you're only doing it because somebody else said you should do it, or it's just not, it doesn't give you joy. So finding something that you are excited about. So for instance, I remember speaking to one of my mentors, and he shared that I kept talking about international criminal law, I kept talking about issues of conflict-related sexual violence, and it's like, Adejoké, you can write a book on this. Well, why don't you write a book and get a doctorate? So like 2 for 1, right? And so if there's something you're passionate about, why not pursue that, but get it, right? Get that extra degree so someone could call you Dr. something for all your hard work.
That's so, I have to say that the title is completely worth it. It's completely worth it. The non-honorary doctor title is completely worth it. A lot of work, but completely worth it. Our poll results are in, and so I'm going to ask our tech team to share that with us. Oh, so we have a large majority of our audience not having a PhD. We're really glad to hear that, because that's who we're talking to. And we're happy to see that we're not preaching to the choir. So thank you for coming if you were really thinking about this. Very few of our pollsters think that a PhD is not beneficial to their trajectory. And I think that's a really good way to think about it. And so I'm happy to see that that's the result. And we have a very large percentage of people, 81% of our audience is interested in pursuing a PhD. This is really great news for us, particularly if because as Kholo said, we struggle with expertise on the continent, and capacity is is a struggle for nearly every African country, and part of the reason we have trouble trading as equals with the global north and that sort of thing, that human capacity is a big challenge for us. So I'm really excited that these are the results. Thank you for participating in the poll, and please join the conversation on social media using the hashtag IAWL, #Wella, #Power2Pivot, #PhD, #African Women in Law. We'll be doing great things. People, join the conversation. And let's keep the guidance and the reassurance in the community going. So I'm gonna ask our panelists to give us a sound bite to take with us, each of our 81% audience looking to do a PhD, an inspiring message to take with us, and then I'll take your questions. So I will start with Kholo.
For me, just to tell you sort of personally, I applied for my PhD 6 months pregnant. And so there is never a time the perfect time to do anything. If this is something that you wanted to do, if it's something that you're passionate about, I say go for it. I would caution if you're doing it just for the beauty, because there's a lot of work involved. There's just never a perfect time in life. And if you can plan something and just execute and be committed, everything is doable.
Thank you, Kola. Adejoké?
Yeah, so I would say there is, just like Kola said, there's a perfect time. Don't rush the decision to do a doctoral program. Make sure it fits within your career vision. And then also get rid of the perfectionist mentality. It does not help you. I had a conversation with one of my mentors very recently, and I was anxious that I wasn't necessarily producing my best. I thought it's not good enough. And he said, when you finish, it is good, right? So when you're done, it is perfect. A finished PhD is the perfect PhD, basically. And so remember your goal. Don't be overly ambitious trying to, cure cancer with your PhD research, or solve, accountability issues for conflict-related sexual violence, which was my initial goal. Like, be realistic and focus on what will bring you joy in the process.
Thank you. Very good thoughts. Shingi?
So I would just add to that I think your life or career trajectory doesn't have to be orthodox. It doesn't have to check some sort of predefined set of boxes. I think to liberate ourselves from the idea that there's a way that we have to be, or a way that our careers and lives have to unfold, and that it is worthwhile pursuing your passions and your interests, because I think that's where greater joy and gratification lie. But also that, I think opportunity lies when you sometimes veer off the beaten track, or sort of do the unusual things. When you follow your passions and your heart, interesting things can happen if you do that. So yeah, don't feel constrained to do the orthodox or the ordinary or the regular.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm going to run that by you guys very quickly. We have 20 minutes left. So I'm going to ask, our first question is from Jamal, and his question is to Adejoké. And he asks, how did you go about funding for the DIA at SAIS? I'm not sure I understand that question. Too many initials.
Okay, so hey Jamal, how did I go about funding for the Doctor of International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies? So that's SAIS. So they do give a scholarship, but it's not a lot. And to be honest, right now, I can't even remember whether I think it's embedded in the application process. And so you do get something, but then that ties in with what I said earlier about juggling work. And so I was working, at least for the first semester, working and studying full time. So I was doing full-time work, studying full-time. And obviously the salary was able to help offset some of the tuition fees and so on. There are different organizations that you can apply to for funding. If SAIS is somewhere that you are interested in going to, I would suggest that you start looking up those organizations in advance. Because by the time I discovered them, this is some of the challenges with this. There's a lot of resources out there, but maybe we just don't know about them. So by the time I discovered them, unfortunately, when that deadline had passed, so they weren't applicable for me. So I would suggest taking some time ahead of time to research and reach out to different organizations to see if you can get some funding.
Thank you. I have two questions from Irene N. I'm going to address one to Shingi because she talked about relocating, and the other about to Kholo because you talked about societal change. So the first question to Shingi is an external or part-time PhD program plausible when I may not be able to afford relocating to another country for full-time PhD? Is an external program recommended?
So I guess the easy question is a part-time PhD program plausible? Yes, it is. I think lots of schools do have part-time programs. So that's definitely viable. I know in some places it has limitations, for example, related to your visa. So I think in the UK, if you're not a UK student, I think you can't do a part-time PhD. I think it's only open to UK residents or EU residents. So yes, there are programs that are part-time, but you just need to look into whether there's additional eligibility requirements related to taking the part-time option. But actually, as I think about it, a lot of people I know are actually doing PhDs part-time whilst also studying. So it's entirely viable and possible. As to doing it, I think when you say external, I assume you mean if you're not able to relocate, so doing it remotely. Again, I think it depends on the program. I imagine there are some programs that allow you to be not located at your school. A lot of schools do have some version of a residency requirement, which is basically a requirement that you spend a certain amount of time in the location where your school is, or sort of in person present at the school. But what I will say is that I think that landscape might shift a little bit post-COVID, because whilst my program has actually fairly stringent residency requirements, because of COVID, a lot of that changed. So I ended up doing the first year of my program effectively remotely, and it worked out just fine. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future some programs relax those residency requirements, or introduce. I will say is that I think residency requirements tend to be strictest in the first year of your program, where they sort of are trying to make sure you have a viable proposal and sort of getting you onboarded with the research training, etc. A lot of people from their second year onwards actually end up working remotely or elsewhere. Sometimes that means you have to apply for permission from your school to be abroad or somewhere else, but I think it definitely gets more feasible from your second year onwards. So program dependent, but I think there's flexibility and options around both going part-time and being remote.
And I would add, don't try to find 4 years worth of complete funding before you set up, because like Shingi said, a lot of the requirements are first year specific, and there's opportunities on the other side of every institution that you have to be on the inside to know about. So you may not be able to afford to relocate for 4 years, but do try to think about whether you could afford to relocate for one, and take it from there. The question I was going to ask Kholo from Irene was whether she should consider an interdisciplinary angle if she's looking to make societal change, or if a PhD in a straight up law division is useful.
Before I answer that very, very relevant question, especially relevant to me, I would like to, sort of make a plug for European universities for PhDs. Because like me, they consider you as a research assistant. So it's a professional, you're hired by the university and you're paid. So you don't even pay school fees. They pay you, a stipend, which is not, it's something, right? And I mean, obviously, when you compare it to what you're earning as a professional, then it's, quite a, not so much. But if you're a student and you want to go into institutions that you don't have to worry about funding, you don't have to apply for funding, because it's implied that you're going to be working in your project or in your PhD as a, a research assistant, then you're paid for it. So I would definitely encourage anybody who's interested to look on mainland Europe. Netherlands is very good. Switzerland is also very good. And, opportunities are growing in countries like Germany as well for English, the English language, and of course, Sweden and sort of those Nordic countries as well. So I just wanted to give you that information. As for interdisciplinary, so I am like the queen of interdisciplinary, because I just have a lot of interest. So I have a background in law, in international relations, and in economics. And this is how I found myself in trade. And so, but I don't think that you need to have an interdisciplinary degree, which for me, I kind of am, because I'm doing sort of the mix between tech and trade in order to make societal change. I mean, I think it depends on what you do. I think there's very many sort of solid, singular topics in law that you can do whatever you want in that topic, and you don't necessarily need to look at, whatever economics and law or whatever the case may be. So just look at what you want to do, what you're interested in, and you'll always almost find a topic that's relevant in law, because basically, everything is regulated. And if it's not, that's an opportunity. So that's just my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Ko. I have a bunch of questions that I'm going to group, and I'm going to point to an answer to, and then there are a few others that I'm going to actually mention because we're running out of time. So I have several people asking about the time to do a PhD, and whether it's better to do some practice first or to do to go straight into it from school, or when it's a good time to leave practice, how many years of practice. So all of those questions, first of all, I think that the panelists have spoken quite at length about these issues. And so I'm going to sum up what they said for you, which is that it's a person-dependent choice, but you've got to look at your circumstances, what you want, what your direction is, and what your current obligations are. I don't think any of them would say, oh, 2 years. 2 years is when you go, or 5 years. I think as Adejoké said, you've got to know, you've got to have some requirements for the institution, and Shingi talked about knowing whether this is when it's feasible as opposed to when it's the best time. And Kholofelo talked about considering the loss of a salary, and she's just now talked about European universities because of the possibility of earning an income as you go through this. So there are many things to consider, and I don't think anybody here can give you the perfect timeline moment on 12th November 2025, send in the application. I think it would be very misleading of us to do that. So the question that I think I would like to share with the panelists is what about family responsibilities, and how you work that into the PhD life. That's actually is a question that, from a very personal point of view, I would like the panelists to address, because I went to the PhD with children. Kholofelo has a family, so this is a challenge. It's a special set of challenges. You know, Joke was talking about her cohort mate with 4 kids. It's a special set of challenges you have when you do it with family. So any words of advice on that one, really quickly?
Ditch your family and run. Go to an island far away from your family. Yeah, that's my. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to me.
Kholofelo, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, sure. So as I said to you, when I applied for my PhD, I was 6 months pregnant, and I was just like, you'll see the discriminator against me, you know, just anticipating like getting it because I'm pregnant. But, you know, I think the world has changed now. And seriously, my PhD supervisor is amazing. And she's also a woman who went through a PhD with 2 children. And for me, so my second child was born 2 months after I started my PhD, and I'm on maternity leave now, and I'm going back on the 1st of April. So, I mean, this whole thing about nothing ever works the way that you want it. It's not linear, you know, do your thing when you want it, and just sort of make sure that your systems are in place. I just happen to have a really supportive husband who is a medical doctor. So I'm always like, I'm coming for you. I'll also be Dr. Kugler. And we've, you know, both got very demanding careers, as you can imagine, and we just kind of, you know, make it work. You know, if it was last week, I would have had my 4-month-old sitting here watching me, but luckily I could drop her off at the daycare for a couple of hours, and you just kind of build your tribe. I mean, I'm in Switzerland, I'm from South Africa, I don't have any family here. So, you know, line up your daycare centers, line up your nannies, line up your best friends who you're going to be a support system while you cry, because you'll be up at 3 a.m. with the child screaming and you've got like something due the next day. So I think you just have to take it, you just have to prioritize. You can't do everything at the same time. And so, yeah, I would say it's doable, of course, like with anybody, not just people with children, but of course, people have different challenges. So just make sure that you plan, and sleep train.
Sleep train. I swear by children's bedtimes, because if your kids don't have a bedtime, you have no time when it stops and you have a moment to breathe and think. Shigi, someone wants to know what's the best way to approach a potential supervisor. I remember you said that you wrote to people and asked if they were taking students. So I thought you might be able to share some insight on what's the best way to open that very awkward conversation with a random stranger.
Yes, and I think that's a really good question. So I actually spent a chunk of time Googling on the internet to see what is people's advice. It's not actually that difficult. I think obviously you look up the person's profile. ascertain what their research interests are. If you really want extra brownie points, consider looking at 1 or 2 of their publications just to get a bit more texture around what they do. And then send a very brief email that sort of says, you know, hi, my name is Shingira Masanzu. I'm looking to apply for a PhD, blah, blah, blah. My research interests are in A, B, C, D. I saw your work is related to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm very interested in thing that they do. I therefore wanted to find out if you are, you know, taking on research students, or if you might be able to, if you might be available for a brief chat to discuss my research interests further, whatever it is that you want. But I would say, do your research on the person, be very clear on the link between what they do and what you want to do, and then be very clear on your ask. Is it that you're asking if they're taking on students? Are you asking for a short chat with them to explore further, etc.? I will say, related to that, that not everyone will respond. I think it is the norm. It is, I think, fairly common for people to reach out to supervisors, but not everyone replies, has been my experience. Some people will reply and be very much, I'm not taking on students, or some schools actually tell potential supervisors not to engage in correspondence with applicants to avoid issues or, you know, accusations of bias or discrimination in the student selection process. So you might get some people who are not able or willing to engage in a conversation. And then the last thing I will say is that it is nonetheless possible to apply and get into programs without having reached out to a supervisor. So some schools actually say, don't worry about the supervisor. If there's a research match, we will assign a supervisor to you. So, you know, there's different permutations, but the simple way is do your research, send a really brief, pithy email with a clear connection between your work and theirs, and a clear ask at the end of it. That's that.
Like she said, keep it brief, because they're not going to read a 15-page email from a random student, potential student. So thank you for the very helpful pointers. There's a question about whether multidisciplinary PhD is a good idea. And I think Kholo has addressed the idea of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. The only reason I bring it up again is because our questioner, who's I think Adejoké Talabi, says she doesn't want to set herself up for failure because of the idea of doing a big multidisciplinary project. So I would very quickly say, as they have pointed out several times, you have so much flexibility with your topic and to carving it out in ways that make it possible for you to keep your arms around. But if Joki wanted to say something about that really quickly, that would be helpful. Don't be overwhelmed by fear. None of us was entirely certain we'd succeed when we set out. Just
Exactly.
keep your arms around what you can.
Yeah, and actually Maame is the only person here who actually has the PhD. We're all still in the process, still figuring it out. And so just to say on the multidisciplinary, I think ultimately it's really personal to you in terms of what it is you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to accomplish. Shingi mentioned earlier, there isn't any set way of doing things. Don't feel obliged to fall into any cookie cutter. So if you are interested in pursuing a multidisciplinary PhD, by all means, go for it. You know, like don't limit yourself to what somebody may think may work for you, because we don't know tomorrow. You may actually be charting the course by taking that particular approach.
If I can just add on that, Maame, I would also just add to that to say, sort of do your research also if you do decide to go interdisciplinary, because I think some programs, like say you pick something really technical, like something in IT, some programs might require you to have a particular background in order to thrive based on what the IT half of your degree or the economics half of your degree requires you to do. So do some research and sort of see if the programs are flexible enough, either have support for training for you to skill up or allow you to design your PhD in a way that doesn't sort of leave you in deep water. But the second thing I would say is that I think actually a lot of PhDs are interdisciplinary. So I'm sitting in the law school, but my work right now is predominantly about development theory, economics, construction, project finance. The law piece is kind of in the background, but there is a lot of interdisciplinarity anyway, even if you house your PhD in a specific department or discipline.
Thank you. And I would add that if you're trying to do multidisciplinary work, do check to make sure that you can find more than the supervisors in the specific fields in the same institution. Because it's a shame not to get in when you have a great proposal, because one half of your proposal cannot be supervised at that institution. So just make sure that the institution has the expertise for it.
And just to add to that, again, it goes back to the point that we said earlier about research in institutions, right? So for instance, at Johns Hopkins, I'm able to have, like, so my main supervisor, primary supervisor is at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies. And then you can have your second and third on your committee. Your third could be from anywhere else. So if you, for instance, so you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, well, I'm able to get my primary supervisor at the institution, but the institution allows me to reach out to others in other institutions or even in practice. So SAIS actually even prefers that one of your committee members is a practitioner. Again, it goes back to the point that I mentioned that this is a very practitioner-oriented program. So if that is what you're interested in, look at schools that have that flexibility, you know, so that you're not boxed in, where you say, I'm doing a multidisciplinary Ph.D., but I'm unable to find anybody who can supervise the different aspects. If you have a school that allows for that flexibility, then that might be a better fit for you.
I just wanted to jump in because, I mean, I'm not necessarily doing a multidisciplinary PhD per se, but my PhD kind of lends itself to that, in that I'm looking at how AI is regulated in trade law. And you might have to do a lot more research on the technical side, which I'm finding that I have to do, that I'm learning like how machine learning works and algorithms, which is something that I never actually thought, because I thought, I'm just going to look at the law. So, you know, to be open to the fact that you might be doing a little bit more research on the non-law part and sort of, you know, look out for opportunities. I've seen some workshops, you know, training, you know, might have to reach out to people. So also think about, you know, the parts that might not be, you know, obvious when you start.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful thinking points. Two last questions. I'm completely out of time, and but because they're very quick, I'm going to ask them. Kuji Mataba wanted to know if we all had complete research proposals at the time we applied. And then Perpetual wanted to know how to deal with difficult supervisors and the risks involved in changing supervisors midway who are difficult. That question could have a whole conversation about it. So I'm just going to quickly say, don't let the fear of a difficult supervisor be the reason you don't do it, but do your research. And in my case, my supervisor was also my graduate advisor, so I knew him. But for people who have gone into that blind, some of the good advice I have heard was if you can find a current student, ask what they're like. It's helpful to ask what the people are like as supervisors before you specifically ask for them. But I'm going to let the panelists respond very quickly because I have just 1 minute. Do you want to start, Shingi?
Yeah, sure. On complete research proposals, I think the quick answer is it really depends on what your application, the school requires in its application. So for example, for LSE, they needed a 2,000-word research proposal. Oxford needed 600 words. None of those are going to be fully developed research proposals. And inevitably what happens is that during the course of your first year, whatever it is, you flesh out, revise, and build out on your research proposal. But so you don't need to have a complete research proposal. You need to have an idea of the question, the area, the gap that your research is trying to fill. And then the degree of completeness of your proposal, I think, will be driven by what each program requires as part of the application package.
So no, I did not. I just knew what I wanted to do, and I slotted into a research program that was fully funded at the University of Lucerne. So I didn't have to write anything. I just submitted my CV and I had an interview.
That's pretty amazing. No, I also did not. I did not. And like Shingi, they asked for, you know, an idea of what you want. The reality is that there are a lot of students who come in saying, this is what I'm going to do my research in. You get in there your first year. And this is common, especially in US programs, where after your first year, first semester, you actually go down a different path. So I don't think there's any expectation that you need to have a complete proposal that you must now stick to at all costs. But again, it goes back to doing your research on the school. And then just about the research on the school, like for instance, I did a bunch of interviews. So interviewing students about the school. So like I said at the very beginning, in as much as, I wanted to get into a program that I liked and so on, I was actually interviewing the school, if you could put it that way. So I spoke to many students, and like was mentioned, you get information about the supervisors, but also bear in mind, take everything with a pinch of salt, right? Because someone can say the supervisor is absolutely terrible, but they don't tell you about themselves and what they contributed to that relationship. And so, it's important that once you finally have a supervisor to sit down and have that conversation about expectations and so on, because it's a two-way thing. Your supervisor is also extremely busy. They can't be there to cater entirely to your needs, especially if your needs are uncommunicated.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. I am completely out of time, so I'm going to have to end this discussion, which has been fabulous. It's been interesting learning, finding the similarities, but also the differences in the journeys that we have had to get to this point, and to encourage other women to set out and do it. It's never going to be easy, and it's never going to be perfect, but we aren't more miraculous than you. So if we're doing it, then you just need to get your research in order, and not jump in blind, but do jump in. So I'm going to have to close out. I'm so sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer your question. Please follow us on the and keep up with the Institute of African Women in Law on Facebook. If you look in the chat, we've put in all of the information about how you can find us. And stay tuned. We have more programs for you to help you think through these processes. I would just say on the complete research proposal thing, I went to Oxford. They asked for 600 words. Cambridge asked for 3,000. So I did the Cambridge proposal, and then I kind of shrunk it into the Oxford proposal. And the most puzzling question I had in my first year was, after I got there, my supervisor asked me, so what's your DPhil going to be on? And I thought, but that's what I said. And I found in the journey that my DPhil, as I submitted it, is only distantly related to what I proposed on the first day. It evolves, it grows, you get better. It hurts, but it hurts in a good way. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for coming. We hope that you found this conversation illuminating and enjoyable. A PhD is one of the most accelerating professional development experiences you could ever have. You don't need to have all the answers before you start about how you'll pay for it and exactly which jobs you'll be able to secure. You should have no doubt that you care about the issue enough to sustain your interest in thinking, researching, and exploring it over several years of your life. And if you do, then you will see the project to the end. If you're intrigued by the possibilities that PhD could hold, now's a very good time to start your research on what schools and topics and supervisors could be a good fit for you. If you are already seriously considering it, we encourage you to plan, prepare, seize the power, and pivot. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a very good week. And thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very enjoyable.